So first of all, thank you everyone for joining us, and I'm excited to introduce you all Gina, educator with nearly 30 years of experience at the Princeton Review. Gina has written a key AP exam prep books, and she has also worked as a senior content developer. And her clear and engaging teaching style has helped so many of the students understanding the tough concepts. So we are looking forward to you, Gina, for benefiting from her advice, skills, and advice. So now over to you, Gina.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me. My name is Gina Donegan. I am a longtime GMAT teacher for the Princeton Review. So today, my goal is to share with you everything I know about the GMAT. And right now, I am just trying to make sure that I can share my screen with you so you can see my slides. For some reason, I'm having a difficult time doing that. I apologize. So I may need to reset some things here. But while I'm bringing that up, let me just give you a little basic information about the GMAT and why you should care about this test. So first of all, the GMAT is a major exam used for admission to American business schools. And I'm assuming that most of you here are here because you are interested in pursuing an MBA, Master's in Business Administration, or a similar type of degree. Now, keep in mind there are a lot of different MBA degrees in the United States, a lot of different programs, different colleges that offer these programs. You don't necessarily need the GMAT for all of them. But I will say that you need the GMAT exam if you want to get into a sort of highly desirable or prestigious program. If you're looking to really go places, as we say in American business, you do typically need to attend a program that requires the GMAT. So that's why we're here. But again, keep in mind there are lots of different schools with different standards. So there's going to be a lot of variation in what you find. But I'll assume that everybody here is probably interested in attending an American business school, and you're looking to get into a good program that will, get you into a better job. So again, I'm still having a little trouble sharing my PowerPoint presentation. I'm not sure why that is. So what I'm going to do is I'll keep on talking and I'll see if I can reload that program and hopefully be able to bring it up for you. So first of all, the GMAT exam, it's good to know, has undergone some major changes just in the past year. Okay, so it's possible that if you were looking online, you might find information that's outdated. So to be clear, I'm going to give you everything you need to know about the modern version of the GMAT. And by the way, this test for a brief time was called the GMAT Focus. It's no longer being called the GMAT Focus. But if you happen to see any information online about the GMAT Focus, just be aware that that's what they're talking about, is the same test that I'm going to give you here. Again, there could be a lot of outdated information about the GMAT online. So just keep in mind that you don't want to be using that old information. Okay, let's see. I believe I finally was able to share my screen. And so I'm going to assume everybody sees it, but if anybody can't see it, just let me know. It says GMAT Strategy Session. I think we're all on the same page now. Okay, so before we dive into more detailed information, I want to just give you an idea of what Manya can do to help you with the GMAT. Manya partners with the Princeton Review, which is an American company. We specialize in all standardized tests, including the GMAT. And Manya offers things like one-on-one private tutoring. They offer prep courses. The best prep courses are the ones that allow you to talk and interact with a real teacher like me. I teach a lot of GMAT courses myself. We also offer self-paced preparation, practice tests, including some free practice tests if you need one, And you can even call Manya and get some one-on-one help with your business school plan. So Manya is there for you every step of the way, and we can definitely answer specific questions about that at the end if you're interested. So now that I have my slides loaded, thank you for your patience. We're going to talk about 3 things today. We're going to talk about why you should take the GMAT. I've already mentioned a little bit of that. We're going to talk about understanding how the GMAT exam is structured, how it's scored, how you actually take this test. And I'm also going to tell you a little bit about how you can improve your scores, and we might even have time to take a peek at some sample questions. So that's the plan for today's session. So first of all, why should you take the GMAT? As I mentioned, the GMAT is required by a lot of the more desirable business school programs in the United States. Now, some business schools will also accept an alternative test called the GRE, which is Graduate Record Exam. It's a completely different test. It has different content other than what I'm going to show you today. But yeah.
Yeah, Gina, sorry to interrupt, but I'm not able to see your presentation.
Okay. Well, for some reason, mine says I am sharing. Okay, let me try it again.
Yeah,
How
now
about
it's
now?
visible. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Sorry, everyone, for the technical problems. You didn't miss much on the slides, by the way. I was just beginning to talk about one possible alternative to the GMAT, which is called the GRE. Just be aware, though, that not all business schools are going to accept the GRE. So if you want to be able to apply to any business school with success, I would recommend that you take the GMAT. And the GMAT is written by an organization called the Graduate Management Admission Council. Everyone calls them GMAC for short. And by the way, you can get more information about GMAC and the GMAT exam at gmac.com. But mainly, you're just going to be able to register for the test. There are a few free resources that they provide for you there, but of course, they're not going to prepare you for the test the way Manya could. So GMAC is a good resource if you just want to find out about how you can sign up for the test or when you can sign up for the test. But of course, they're not necessarily going to give you a lot of secrets on how to get a higher score. Now, let's talk a little bit about what GMAT scores mean and what kinds of scores would get you into certain programs. The GMAT is scored on a scale of 205 to 805, which is a little unusual. It actually used to be 200 to 800, but when they changed the GMAT in the past year, they actually changed the scoring, 205 to 805. And so what I have on the screen here are average scores for different kinds of programs. Now, probably most of you have heard of very prestigious places like Stanford and Harvard. So you can see that their GMAT averages are well above a 700, around 730. Their average GPAs are also quite high, definitely above a 3.5, and their admission rates are extremely low. So we all know these are very prestigious programs. And by the way, if you're not familiar with the American GPA scale, it goes on a range of 0 to 4. So a 3.77 would be a very high GPA. And if you are attending an undergraduate institution where they did not score on that 4-point scale, the business schools do have a way of making the conversion from whatever your grades were to the 4-point scale. So Ivy League business programs are obviously highly competitive, and GMAT scores tend to be quite high. Remember, I'm giving you averages, so there are some people applying to Stanford and Harvard with scores closer to an 800. But as you can see, there are a wide variety of business schools that have lower standards, right? So if you don't think you can get over a 700, then there are lots of business schools that accept people in the 600s or even in the 500s. Anything below a 500 would be considered quite below average, and what that means is it would probably only get you into business schools that accept virtually all their applicants, which means not prestigious programs. And as you can see, there are very few schools that would have an average GPA of below a 3. So that means obviously your grades have to be good in addition to your GMAT score. And by the way, that's just a random list of business schools. You can find a lot more information about this at particular websites for schools. They often publish more of their data in case you have a particular college that you want to attend. So let's talk about some of the practical things you might be wondering about. Just how do I take the GMAT, or when should I take the GMAT? Well, first of all, the answer to when you should take the GMAT is really you should consider taking it soon. And that's because I'm assuming that all of you are either in college or recently graduated. Maybe you have a job, but you haven't been in the workforce very long. And that's a good thing, because if you did any kind of math while you were in college, or even obviously high school, that math is going to be fresher in your mind now than it will be in, say, 5 years. There's a lot of math on the GMAT. So that's why a lot of people do choose to take the test sooner rather than waiting too long, because the longer you wait, the more you start to forget some of the math that you've learned before. Now, in terms of how to take the test, there are two ways to take it. You can either take it at a testing center. And of course, in the United States, testing centers would be very common. They'd be in a lot of different locations. The testing centers are also international, but may be a little more limited depending on where you live. But you also have the option of taking the GMAT at home on your home internet connection with your home computer. Now, if you choose to do that, you obviously need a very reliable computer and reliable internet connection that won't disconnect during the test. But it's nice to have different ways to take the GMAT. But it's always a computer-based test. There is no paper and pencil GMAT anymore. And if you do choose to take it, you have a wide variety of options as to when you can take it. It's not just given at, say, 1 day per month, or only on Saturdays. It's offered at a variety of different times. So if you have a challenging schedule, if you're trying to work around other commitments, you have a lot of flexibility as to when you can take the GMAT. And again, the reason why it benefits you to take the GMAT fairly soon is because if you want to go to business school, you typically want to try to build up a resume beforehand. Most business schools are going to want to see that you went out there and worked in the business world before you applied to business school. But your GMAT scores are valid for up to 5 years. So even if you are in the job market right now, or maybe you currently have a job that you're committed to, there's no reason why you need to wait to take the GMAT. You can take it whenever it's convenient for you, and then decide at a later date when you want to apply to business school. Typically, people are just going to be stronger if they take the GMAT at a younger age, when, again, the math is fresh in your mind, or maybe you're accustomed to academic reading, because there's a lot of reading on the GMAT, and a lot of data interpretation. So take it when you're in that academic mode, and not so much in the going to work mode, which is a little different. But even if you feel like you have forgotten some of the math material that you learned along the way, that's what Manya is here for, right? To help you to review all that material. In a full-length Manya prep course, we do cover all of the math that you need to know for the GMAT, and also everything you need to succeed in the verbal section, because that is a big challenge as well. So the GMAT is designed to test the kind of skills you will use in business school, which are primarily the ability to read and understand data, sometimes large amounts of data. And when I say data, I mean things like charts, graphs, numerical data like percentages, trends, but also written information, right? Being able to read something and understand what you're reading. They're also testing you on the ability to logically analyze an argument. You know, how well can you take a position and think about the pros and cons of that position, or perhaps how to strengthen the position and make it more persuasive. And of course, they're testing you on math skills. So there's a heavy emphasis on things like calculating percentages, looking at statistics. For instance, there's virtually no geometry on the GMAT because you won't be doing any geometry in business school. So they are trying to test you on the skills that you will actually use in business, which makes sense. However, they do not expect you to know anything about business. So if you know virtually nothing about economics or how to start a business or how to manage or, you know, finance in the United States, don't worry about it. You're not going to need to know any of that. Now, there are going to be reading passages on the test that might be focused on these topics, but they don't presume that you have any outside knowledge. Anyone taking the GMAT should be able to understand the reading passages without any real outside knowledge about business. Now, you could find that you have some issues with vocabulary. Maybe occasionally they will put a vocabulary word in a passage that you don't know. And so that could be a challenge. That could be something to work on along with the rest of your GMAT practice. You know, maybe start a vocabulary list of words or terms that you're not familiar with. But that's as far as it goes. If you are able to look up the definition of the word in a dictionary and memorize what it means, then you don't need any other outside knowledge about the topic. So really what the GMAT does test you on is critical reasoning abilities, which really means just your ability to read and analyze what you've read, your ability to evaluate an argument. So there are a lot of questions in the verbal section that have a fictional speaker who might be trying to convince you of something. And your job is to determine, you know, what are the strengths or weaknesses of that argument? What is the conclusion that the author wants you to draw? Or what is an inference you can make from the argument? That's a big portion of the verbal section. And in my opinion, it's the most challenging part of the verbal section. This is where you really need some assistance. You can't necessarily figure out these arguments on your own. There's definitely a technique to it. Now, there's one section of the test called data insights, which is really about data interpretation. Those are the charts and graphs that I was telling you about. Also a lot of reading comprehension. So you could read a passage on any topic, sometimes business related, sometimes not. Sometimes it's science or the humanities. And you'll be asked questions about what you read. So obviously that's about just your ability to read effectively in English. There is no writing section. I want to stress that. There used to be an essay on the GMAT, but there is no longer any essay. So that's good news. That's one less thing that you have to prepare for. Graphical interpretation is a lot like data interpretation. The only difference is that graphical interpretation may be more like a diagram or a flow chart, something that's a bit more visual and not as mathematical. We definitely see those in the data insights section. And then finally, logical reasoning, which is just your ability to use logic to determine the answer to a question. Now, that is mostly going to appear in the math section, but it could also even be in the data insights section. Keep in mind, when I say math, GMAC likes to call this the quantitative section. So you'll hear people refer to it as quantitative or quant. I call it math. It's the same thing. So let's talk about how how the GMAT actually works and how it's scored. Because the GMAT is scored in a way that is unlike any other test you've taken before. For instance, if you perhaps wanted to attend an American university, you may have taken a test like the SAT or the ACT. Or it's even possible that you may have taken another test like, say, the GRE. Different tests are scored in different ways, but most tests tend to be scored in what we call a linear fashion. And that just means that your score is determined by the number of right and wrong answers that you achieve, right? So if you get, 90% of the answers right, then you'll get a certain score. If you only get 40% of the questions right, then you'll get a much lower score. It's usually pretty straightforward. But the GMAT is not scored in that way. And it's important for you to understand how it is scored in order to have a better strategy for taking this test. The GMAT is what we call adaptive. And that means that in any section, the first question you receive will be of medium level of difficulty. And that's because the computer is set up to assume that you are the average test taker. The computer doesn't know if you're really bright and you're going to answer a lot of questions right, or if you're unprepared and you're going to answer a lot of questions wrong. So it will start you off with a medium level question. If you answer that first question correctly, then the second question you receive will be a little bit harder. It won't necessarily be the hardest question, but it will be a little bit harder than question number one. If, on the other hand, you miss question number one, you answer it incorrectly, then question number two will be a little bit easier. And again, it won't be the easiest question on the test, but it will be a little bit easier than question number one. And the entire test is going to proceed in this manner. If you answer a question correctly, the next question will be a little harder. If you answer a question incorrectly, the following questions will be a little bit easier. And so obviously, if you're really skilled on the GMAT, right, the questions are just going to get harder and harder and harder, which seems like it would be a negative thing, right? But it's actually not, because the beauty of the computer adaptive method is that not only do the questions get harder, but you will gain more and more points. Your score will now be much higher than it would have been if you had gotten any questions wrong. And so really what this means in practical terms is that you need to be as accurate as you can be on the first, let's say the first 10 questions in each section. Those are going to tend to disproportionately affect your entire score. Unfortunately, if you miss a lot of questions at the beginning of a section, even if you start to do well after that, there's a point at which your score will not go any higher. The computer will have locked you in to a lower scoring range. So your final score on the GMAT is not simply a question of how many questions you got right and how many questions you got wrong. It really does come down to where your right and wrong answers were. You want to have a lot of correct answers at the beginning of each section. And if you're going to miss any, which, let's face it, we all miss some questions, but if you're going to miss some, it's better to miss more toward the end of the section than at the beginning. So all this means for you is you need to be prepared for everything, because you never know what question number one will be about. You never know what question number two will be about. They can test you on anything. So therefore, you have to be really well prepared to make the most of this computer adaptive system. And of course, following up on my diagram, there is going to be a sort of evening out of the level of difficulty and an evening out of your score, depending on how you do at the beginning. A lot of people are just going to wind up in the sort of medium range, which means the questions are medium level and your score winds up being medium level. It's really only the people who get a large percentage of questions right at the beginning who are going to wind up with those scores over a 700 that I showed you before. So the bottom line is you need to know the GMAT really well, and you need to take a lot of practice tests so that you can get more comfortable with this adaptive scoring system. So let's look in a little bit more detail. I've hinted at all of these sections, but let's look at them in more detail. First of all, quantitative, also known as math. You have 21 multiple choice questions to answer in 45 minutes, which sounds like a fairly generous amount of time, but again, if you are really successful on the questions and they keep on getting harder, obviously the harder ones are going to tend to eat up more time. So we do have to be careful with timing on the GMAT. It's really a test of your knowledge of high school level arithmetic and algebra. There's really no geometry. If you see anything that looks like geometry, it's not real geometry. It's just kind of algebra given maybe on a triangle, but it doesn't require you to know any formulas. And there's no calculus. So really, this is the math that you would have learned pretty early on in your middle school or high school career. One of the things that makes GMAT math challenging is you're not allowed to use a calculator. So you have to be comfortable with doing calculations on paper. Unfortunately, we just can't rely on the calculator for this section. Another section that determines your score is the verbal section. The verbal section has 23 multiple choice questions and you have 45 minutes to answer them. And there are really two primary types of questions: reading comprehension and those logical critical reasoning arguments that I mentioned to you. And it's split up about 50-50 between the two, and those two different types of questions show up throughout the verbal section. And then our third major section is called data insights. In a prior version of the GMAT, this was called integrated reasoning. So again, if you see any old outdated information about the GMAT, you might see that they call it integrated reasoning, but now it's called data insights, and it is a little different from the old integrated reasoning section. So just be aware, it's not the same kind of section with a different name. It's actually slightly different. There are 20 multiple choice questions and you have 45 minutes to answer those. And the questions come in a variety of different types, but it pretty much breaks down into graphic-based questions that involve charts, graphs, short descriptions of fictional scenarios, diagrams. But then there are also questions in data insights that we would just call straightforward math questions. The only thing that makes them different from the math questions in the quantitative section is that they come in a different format. The format is called data sufficiency, and I'm actually going to show you a little example of that later. So really, the data insights section is designed to test your ability to do some, I would call it basic math, but also your ability to make logical inferences based on a large amount of data that they're giving you in the charts and graphs. You are allowed to use a calculator in the data insights section. And I think that's because you're sometimes expected to calculate percentages, and they will be, you know, fairly difficult percentages. So that's why they're allowing you to use the calculator here, but no calculator in the quantitative section. Now, as far as the scoring, each one of these sections is scored on a scale of 60 to 90. Let's call that a subscore. Okay, so you get a subscore in quantitative, a subscore in verbal, a subscore in data insights, and then all of that is combined to form your final overall GMAT score. And the subscores are reported in 1-point increments. So you could get a 84 or an 85, but not an 84.5. All three of these sections are adaptive, the way we talked about. Now, data insights is adaptive in a slightly different way, which I'm not going to get into here, but we would certainly cover that in a full-length course. So, as we said earlier, your total or composite GMAT score goes on a range of 205 to 805, 205 being the lowest, 805 being the highest. The older version of the test would have been 200 to 800. So therefore, you can get a score in 10-point increments. You could receive a score of 735 or 705, but there would be no score of 700. Anyone who has a score of 700 would be assumed to have taken the older version of the test. And again, the scores are valid for up to 5 years. So there will be people applying to business school right now who may have taken the old version of the test. There are people applying who have taken the new version. Business schools are accepting both of these. And I can't tell you exactly how they balance the 3 sections to form the 205 to 805. It's going to depend on the version of the test you take, on what day you take it. It's all sort of scaled and curved, but we could say in rough terms, all 3 sections are going to contribute almost equally to your composite score. Now, here's an example of what scores mean in terms of percentile ranks. And if you are not familiar with percentiles, what they indicate is the percentage of people who would have scored lower than you on the GMAT. So if you do score a perfect 805, that puts you in roughly the 100th percentile. Although technically it's probably not the 100th percentile, it's probably the 99.99th percentile, but it's, let's say, 100. But even if you were to score a 755, that's going to be very close to the 100th percentile again. Not perfect, right? Maybe 99.95%. But the reason why I'm showing you this is to just indicate that there are very few people who score above a 750 on the GMAT. It's a very elite score. That's why the averages that I gave you for Stanford and Harvard were below a 750, because there really aren't many people who score that high. And I think that is because of the adaptive nature of the test. It's because the system is set up to give you harder and harder and harder questions. They're making it virtually impossible to get a perfect score. That's the way the test is designed. So you want to keep that in mind when you're preparing. It's good to aim high, but you also want to be realistic about how high you can score. Even if you did get, say, a nearly perfect score on the SAT, it doesn't necessarily mean you're able to get a nearly perfect score on the GMAT, and that is because of the adaptive nature of the scoring. So most people who are trying to get into very elite programs are aiming more for the 700 to 730 range, because that would be the 99th percentile, which is still a very high score. And you can see that really anything above a 550 or really a 555 on this new test would be considered an above average score. And I would suggest that if you want to get into competitive or semi-competitive programs, you do want to try to be scoring above that 555 range. Anything above a 605 puts you in a very good position for most law schools. In case you're curious, the average or median score on the GMAT is about a 545. So that makes sense based on the percentiles I just showed you. So let's talk about how to actually improve your scores, and then we'll look at some examples. The overall strategies that you need to perform well on the GMAT are, first of all, excellent time management. When the new version of the GMAT was released, which was just within the past year, one of the first things I did was I took a lot of the officially released practice tests, and I actually took those tests several times over. And one of the things I found was that timing is tough on the GMAT. It always has been, but it's especially tough on the newer version of the test. And remember, in order to succeed here, you must answer the questions in order. You don't have the luxury of skipping around the way you do on other tests. Now, there is an interesting feature to the GMAT, which I'll talk about, but let's say that most people are going to need to answer these questions entirely in order. And of course, there's a lot of pressure to do well on the questions at the beginning. So time management is one of the primary things you need to learn strategies for and work on when you're taking practice tests. You also need to learn how to do good process of elimination, particularly in the verbal section. Now, we all know that with math, often it's very clear there's one right answer and there are 3 or 4 wrong answers, right? Depending on what type of test you're taking. But in the verbal section, it's not always 100% clear what the correct answer is. As a matter of fact, in verbal, I don't even say that there's a correct answer. I say that there's a best answer because oftentimes there's more than one answer that might look close. So we really have to think in terms of eliminating the answers we know are wrong. And at Manya, they're going to fill you in on a lot of good trap answers. In other words, here are the trap answers to watch out for in verbal. Sometimes we even have trap answers in the other sections as well, but I think it especially applies to the verbal section. And in my experience, I find that a lot of students like you do need to focus a little more on the verbal section because maybe you are already pretty skilled in math. Maybe you've been doing a lot of math in high school and college, maybe even for your current job, but you're not going to be doing the kinds of things that are expected of you in the verbal section. Now, let me talk about a really useful tool that we have for the newest version of the GMAT. And we have the ability to mark questions as we go along and keep track of them. Now, why would you want to keep track of questions at all? Well, there's an interesting feature on the test. You have the ability at the end of the section to go back and change your answers for up to 3 questions in the section. So let's say you were taking the test, you were working on question number 5. You know you have to choose an answer to question number 5. You can't just skip over it. However, let's say you didn't feel really confident about your answer. What you could do is you could mark that question and keep track of it. And then at the end of the section, you have the ability to actually go back to that question, rework it, and potentially change your answer. And if you do change your answer to, let's say you answered it incorrectly, but then you go back and fix it and you fix it to the correct answer, then you will actually gain points by doing that because obviously you now have a correct answer instead of an incorrect answer. And again, you can do this on up to 3 questions in each section. So this is a nice feature of the GMAT. It allows you to, go back and correct mistakes. But the question is, well, which questions should I go back to, right? Which ones would be good candidates? Since you can't go back to all of them, how do you know which ones to go back to? And how can you make sure that you're not actually changing a correct answer to an incorrect answer, right? So there's a little bit of strategy that goes into that flag for review feature. All of these things are things that we focus on in a full-length course. So now what I'd like to do is show you some examples of particular types of questions. These are questions that are a little unique to the GMAT. You probably wouldn't see many of these on other types of tests. And again, if you do think of any questions along the way, feel free to just hang on to those until the end, and I'd be happy to answer your questions. So we're now going to look at a type of question that shows up in the Data Insights section. In the Data Insights section, I mentioned to you that some of the questions are really just math questions. But they're not asked in the typical sort of multiple choice way. The questions that show up in Data Insights are what we call data sufficiency questions, and they're structured exactly like what I have on the screen here. What they'll do is they'll ask you a question. In this case, the question is, is x plus y greater than 8? Now, when you look at that question, you might immediately think, well, if I knew what x was and I knew what y was, I could answer that question, right? But usually they're not going to make it that easy for you. They're not going to simply give you the value of x and the value of y. They're usually going to make it more challenging. But what they're really trying to test you on is not so much your algebraic skills, it's really just your ability to determine what kind of information would be sufficient to answer that question. And again, probably going beyond the obvious, knowing what X is or knowing what Y is. So let's take a look at statement number 1. Statement number 1 tells us that X plus Y plus 3 equals 13. Now, if you remember your algebraic manipulation at all, you can probably remember that we could simply subtract 3 from both sides of this equation, and we could say that X plus Y equals 10, right? So is X plus Y greater than 8? Yes, it is. Although it doesn't really matter whether it's greater than 8 or not. All that really matters is we were able to determine the answer to the question. In other words, statement number 1 is sufficient information to answer the question. That's why we call these data sufficiency. So that takes care of statement number 1. And if you know that statement number 1 is sufficient, there are some answers you can automatically eliminate. Because notice the second answer said that statement 1 is not sufficient, right? So we know the correct answer is not that one. The third answer told us that neither statement alone is sufficient. Well, that has to be wrong too, because we know statement 1 is sufficient. And we can also eliminate the last answer, because the last answer told us that each one is not sufficient in any combination. So it's always good to look at these one statement at a time. Once you determine whether statement 1 is sufficient or not, you automatically eliminate some answers. But let's look at statement number 2. Now, in statement number 2, we have an equation with an X and a Y. And of course, both of those coefficients are 2's. So if we simply divided everything in this equation by the number 2, then we would wind up with the same result we got in statement 1, right? X plus 1 equals 10. And again, that is sufficient to answer the question. Is X plus Y greater than 8? Yes, it is. So the correct answer to this problem is the fourth one. Each statement individually is sufficient to answer the question. We don't need to combine the two equations, right? We can determine the answer to the question just by looking at each one individually. So as you can see, this is very different from a simple multiple choice math question that gives you, 5 numbers to choose from in the answers. This is going to require a bit more strategy, a bit more care, because you can easily fall for a lot of traps here. One trap you could fall for is looking at the two statements together instead of looking at them individually. You could also start to trick yourself a little bit with the question, because in this case, it was a yes or no question, but sometimes the question is worded in a different way. Sometimes they might ask you, what is the value of X plus Y? That's a completely different type of question. So I would say definitely these require a lot more strategy. And fortunately, at Manya, they're going to teach you a very distinct strategy for these that you can use on all of them so that you will always feel confident about your answer. But the good news about data sufficiency is that typically the math itself is not extremely difficult. The math itself is probably a little easier than it would be in the quantitative section. It's all in making sure that you answer the question correctly and you don't fall for any traps when you're evaluating the two statements. Okay, now what I'd like to do is show you an example of a critical reasoning argument. So roughly half the questions in the verbal section look like what I'm giving you here. They will give you a short paragraph. In this case, it's about farming. Then they will ask you a question. This question says, which one of the following would most weaken the commission's conclusion? And then they will give you 5 answer choices. I think what I'd like to do for this is just give you an opportunity to read through this on your own. Go through all 5 of the answers and decide which one you think is the best choice. I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that, and then we'll talk about it together. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to maybe decide which answer you think is the best choice. But as you can see, a lot of these answers sound tempting. And that's what makes critical reasoning arguments challenging, is that a lot of the answers sound tempting. And I'll give you the most important strategy here. The most important strategy is to have a sense of what you're looking for before you look at the answers. So let me show you how I would analyze this argument. The first thing I would want to look for is the commission's conclusion, because the question asks us to weaken that. And we would find that at the end of the argument, right? The end of the argument says the commission reasons that farmers who operate smaller farms plant different crops in an attempt to qualify for as many types of crop subsidies as possible. So that's their conclusion. But what we know from the first sentence is that the number of acres a farmer cultivates, the more types of crops the farmer plants. Notice that is presented as a fact. Okay, the first sentence is a fact. The second sentence is a little more of an opinion, right? It's an opinion of the Agricultural Commission. So when I'm analyzing this argument myself, what I want to try to think about is, what are some possible reasons why they may have an incorrect interpretation, right? What are some reasons why they may be wrong about farmers trying to qualify for crop subsidies? And in very general terms, I would call this a causal argument. They're trying to tell us that the cause or the reason for planting a large number of types of crops is the crop subsidies. In order to weaken any causal argument, you really want to try to find another cause, or you want to try to find a reason why the cause that they've given is not likely to be correct. In other words, a reason why crop subsidies would not be related to number of types of crops. So looking at our options here, hopefully most of you chose the first answer. The first answer is the one that would weaken the best. Because if crop subsidies, which is really in that second sentence, is not based on number of types of crops, let's say it's only based on crop output from previous years, then that means planting a large number of types of crops would not help them to qualify for crop subsidies. It would just be unrelated. That's why it weakens the best. Now let's talk about why some of these other answers might be wrong. First of all, the second answer talks about whether acreage would be an accurate arbiter, or let's say an accurate measurement of crop output. Well, that's really unrelated to the major issues in this argument. It's unrelated to crop subsidies, and it's unrelated to number of types of crops. So the second answer is not right. The third answer might have looked tempting to you, but keep in mind, even if you don't have experience in farming, you still might be able to analyze why farmers are doing something. So answer C is not a very good weakener. The fourth answer is really just a neutral statement, right? Crop output varies widely from year to year. It just doesn't really affect this argument at all. And for the last answer, okay, it mentions commercial gain, but we can't say for sure whether crop subsidies are related to commercial gain. Maybe crop subsidies would be desirable to anybody, if they're farming for any reason. That makes sense. Okay, so we didn't go into a lot of depth here, but as you can see, you have to be really careful with these questions. You have to have a sense of what you're looking for. Otherwise, possibly 3 of the answers could all look correct. So a big part of what you're going to do in a full-length Manya course is talk about how to analyze critical reasoning arguments. It's a really important part of the verbal section. Now I want to show you a little bit about the data insights section. I mentioned to you that data insights is largely a lot of charts, graphs, diagrams, and the challenge here is to make sure that you're understanding the chart and to make sure that you're using the correct part of the chart to answer the question. So let's take a minute to just study this chart and see what it's measuring. The top of it is labeled Hillman Tunnel traffic, and apparently it's on a weekday. Now, if we look at our x-axis is measuring different times of day, right? And it's a 24-hour period, right? So they start out with 7 a.m. and then the end of the chart on the right side is back to 7 a.m. The y-axis is measuring vehicle frequency. Now, I would assume that would just mean number of vehicles at that time of day. And it's broken into 2 categories. The red bars are commercial vehicles and the blue bars are 4 to 8 axle vehicles. And of course, we see variations here. Now, what I notice is that the commercial vehicles are mostly active from midnight to 5 a.m. The commercial vehicles are mostly active from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. But for, say, the 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. time slot, it's about even for both categories. Okay, so once you get acquainted with what the chart is about, it might help to also read any written information they've given you, because sometimes they might give you information that's not on the chart. But what I notice in this information is the first sentence doesn't give us anything new. The second sentence simply tells us that if it's not in the 4x8 category, then that means it has 2 axles. So commercial vehicles have 2 axles. And then the directions say, use the drop-down menu to fill in the blank in each of the following statements based on the information given by the graph. So a common format here is to essentially ask you a question that is multiple choice, but it's not necessarily going to look like the other questions that we've seen. There's going to be a drop-down menu, and you're going to be allowed to choose between a certain number of options, in this case, 4 options. So my tip to you for data insights is always open up the drop-down menus immediately so that you know what your choices are. So let's see what this question is asking for. It says there were approximately some percent more commercial vehicle traffic from midnight to 5 a.m. than there was from 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. So I'd like you to just take a minute. And by the way, you can use a calculator if you want to, because we're allowed to use a calculator in data insights. Just see which answer you think is correct. This is a good time to talk about process of elimination, because probably most of you would know that 1% seems way too small and 223% seems maybe way too big. So the two close answers here are either 25 or 34. Well, pat yourself on the back if you said 34. The reason why it's 34 and not 25 is because the difference between these two numbers is, if we estimate it, approximately 225, right? If I look at the red bar, it's 8:75 for midnight to 5 a.m. It's 6:52 for 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. The difference is approximately 225. But the percentage is going to be 225 out of 650. It's not going to be 225 out of 875, because you're comparing midnight to 5 a.m. against 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. So this is a very typical type of question you might see in data insights. You do have to take your time with the charts to make sure you understand them. You can use process of elimination, just like we can in all parts of the test. And you just want to avoid traps. By the way, you could potentially do this without a calculator, because the numbers and the answers are so far apart from each other that you don't necessarily need a calculator. And sometimes estimating can actually save you a lot of time in this section. So I've given you a number of tips that you can use if you do decide to take this test. I've given you some sample questions, but let's talk about how you can continue to practice on your own. The first thing you can do is take a practice test, and you can find out about this at manyagroup.com. You can also get a Princeton Review prep book on the GMAT, but I would highly recommend the full-length courses that are available to you at manyagroup.com. We have self-prep, we have courses run by a teacher such as me, who you can talk to and interact with, and you can even work with a one-on-one online tutor. So lots of different options for you, and you can feel free to reach out to us after this session if you want to know more about those. So you can learn the strategies you need to score well on the GMAT. We cover everything you need to know, and we also give you access to a large amount of practice material, maybe even more practice material than you would use, but that's a good thing. It's better to have too much practice material and too many practice tests than not enough, and that's what we offer at Manya and the Princeton Review. So at this point, if you do have any questions for me, feel free to ask. I will stay a few minutes more to see if anybody has any questions. If you don't have any questions, then I thank you very much for joining me. Hopefully I've given you some information that you didn't have before, and hopefully I've inspired you to get going on your preparation. So let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, we're done for now, and thank you so much for attending. And somebody a little while ago asked me about whether the GRE or the GMAT is a better option. So let me cover that in case you're still here. First of all, not all business programs are going to accept the GRE. So I think the safest thing to do, if you want to be prepared for any business program whatsoever, is to take the GMAT. But there are a growing number of business schools that do accept the GRE. So let's talk about the basic differences. First of all, the math on the GRE could be slightly easier, although there's a lot of geometry on the GRE. So on the GMAT, we don't have to deal with geometry at all. On the GRE, we do have to deal with geometry along with a lot of other things. So the scope of the math is a little broader, maybe slightly easier, but different. The biggest differences between the GRE and the GMAT would be in the verbal sections. The GRE tests a lot of very challenging vocabulary. So if you're trying to prepare for the GRE, which you can do through Manya as well, you will have to memorize large numbers of English vocabulary words. I mean hundreds of words, okay? That's something you don't need to deal with on the GMAT. And so those are really the major differences. And in my opinion, I think because most people apply to business school with the GMAT score, if you don't have a GMAT score, if you have a GRE score instead, they're going to expect you to have a very strong GRE score. So it's good to have alternatives, but I would say if you're on the fence, try the GMAT first. You might find that easier to deal with just due to the vocabulary issue. Information about the application process. Okay, that's a pretty broad topic, but I'll just give you a rough overview. So to be prepared to apply to most business programs, especially the more prestigious ones, you need a strong GMAT score. That's what we've been talking about. You need to submit transcripts from any undergraduate institutions that you attended. You also need to have a strong resume. So if you have not worked in the business world for very long, that would be something to pursue now as well, because most of those prestigious programs want to see a good resume. And by the way, the average amount of time people spend is, somewhere between 2 to 5 years in the business world working an actual job. So that gives you an idea. You will also need to write some essays. The essays will be assessing just your desire, your reasons for wanting to attend the particular program. And you will also need to submit letters of recommendation. Typically, these are from either employers or maybe college professors, but most people are going to get them from an employer. And there may be some business schools that even require an interview, but typically the interview doesn't come until after you've submitted all that other information. And by the way, a lot of business schools accept people on a regular basis throughout the year. It's not as though there's one application deadline. There could be 2 or even 3, maybe even no application deadline. There are some programs that are rolling where you just kind of send in your application and it's assessed as it's received. So you do want to check the particular deadlines or requirements of the program that you're applying to, because there's a lot of variation. And so welcome to Samriti. Samriti is applying for a Master's of Science in Finance, and you've already started preparing for the GRE. Not necessarily, Samriti. What I would do is make sure you're aware of the particular programs that you want to apply to and what they require. My guess is for the particular degree you're talking about, the GRE should be fine. Okay, it's MBA programs where there could be more variation. But I find the trend overall in the United States is that most MBA programs are accepting both scores. So I certainly don't want to discourage you from taking the GRE. If you're happy with the GRE, then stick with it. So they're really just 2 paths to the same goal for most people.
So, Gina, thank you for just giving us your valuable time. Before we just finish today's session, I just want to share some exclusive benefits for attending this webinar. First, those who have attended this webinar, they all will receive the free psychometric test. Second, they all are going to receive the 30 days free access. So you can enjoy fully access to the Princeton Review GMAT portal. Third, you all are going to receive 1 hour expert session. And after the webinar, one of our counselor will call you to discuss these benefits and help you get started. Please take the call so we can set up everything for you. So thank you for joining us today, and thank you, Gina, for joining us today, for just giving us your very valuable time. We have learned so many things from you. You have given us a very knowledgeable things about the GMAT. So this is all.
You're welcome. Have a good day, everyone.